The number was not a negotiating opener. It was not a gesture. It was not a warning shot. It was a statement of intent, and it landed on Canadian industries like a structural collapse. 50% on steel, 50% on aluminum, 25% on automobiles, sweeping levies on softwood lumber, on forest products, on the arteries of an economy that has been physically woven into the United States for generations. And when the White House press operation reached for the language to describe these actions, the word they chose was irritants, small frictions, minor annoyances, things to be smoothed over with a concession or two before the real business of negotiation could begin. That was the miscalculation. That was the moment this stopped being a standard trade dispute and became something else entirely. A test of whether a smaller country, standing at the edge of an economic relationship it cannot simply walk away from overnight, was still capable of defining its own reality. And on a date that will matter when historians close this chapter, Prime Minister Mark Carney walked into the frame and did the one thing the Trump administration's entire playbook was designed to prevent. He called it what it was: violations, not irritants, violations of a trade agreement both countries signed, both countries ratified, and both countries built billions of dollars of cross-border infrastructure around. That single word, violations, changed the architecture of this entire confrontation. And the response from the other side of the border confirmed that it landed exactly as intended. Because you do not lose your composure over a word that didn't hit something real. This is the story of what actually happened, what the data tells us, what the strategic analysts are now saying publicly and what they're saying privately, and what the next 60 days will determine about a relationship that supports $2.5 billion in trade every single day. And if you work in auto parts or steel or lumber, or if you've been watching your heating bill or your grocery receipt and wondering why the numbers keep climbing, this one is about you, not abstractly, directly. There is a worker we are going to come back to throughout this video. His name doesn't matter for our purposes. What matters is that he is 43 years old. He runs a press line at an auto parts plant in Windsor, Ontario, a city that sits physically across the river from Detroit, Michigan, so close you can read the signs on the other side. He has worked that line for 19 years. He has a mortgage. He has 2 kids in secondary school. And right now, his plant manager has told him that production schedules for the next quarter are under review. That phrase, under review, in the language of manufacturing, means something specific. It means the numbers no longer work. It means the tariff math has eaten the margin. And it means he is waiting. That man is not waiting for a press conference. He is waiting for a number to change. And the negotiation happening right now in Ottawa and Washington will determine whether it does. We know the exact shape of this confrontation because it has been documented at multiple levels simultaneously. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business has been tracking the tariff landscape in real time. And as of this week, the record is unambiguous. Tariffs on steel and aluminum under Section 232 of the U.S. Trade Expansion Act of 1962 remain at 50%. There is no CUSMA exemption for these sectoral levies. They were not paused. They were not renegotiated. They have been sitting on those industries every single day since the Trump administration stripped nearly all exemptions in 2025. A blanket 10% import surcharge now applies to most Canadian goods not protected by CUSMA compliance certification. a legal instrument the administration deployed after the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the original IEEPA tariff authority in early 2026, ruling that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act does not give the President the authority to impose tariffs. The administration's response to that ruling was not to stand down. It was to reach for a different statutory tool and keep the pressure on. We've seen the legislative record. The Congressional Research Service published its analysis this March. In 2025, the United States imposed duties on approximately 13% of all U.S. imports from Canada. That is $50.5 billion in goods that crossed the border and got taxed on the way in. And the Canadian government's own response tells the same story from the other side. Canada currently maintains 25% tariffs on over 300 separate categories of U.S. goods, covering automobiles, steel, and aluminum products. Because the U.S. is still maintaining its own tariffs in those sectors, without offering equivalent relief for Canadian CUSMA compliant exports. 3 separate institutional analyses, Oxford Economics, the Bank of Canada's Monetary Policy Division, and the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, have all reached the same basic conclusion. The effective average U.S. tariff rate on Canadian goods, factoring in exemptions and sectoral levies combined, now sits somewhere between 5.9% and 6.3%. That sounds modest until you understand what it replaced. 18 months ago, that number was near 0. Now here is what the scene actually looked like when Carney stepped in front of cameras to respond to the irritants framing. The context matters. The Trump administration had been pressing Canada to make pre-negotiation concessions just to secure a seat at the formal CUSMA review table. Not concessions as part of a deal. Concessions as the price of admission to the room where the deal would eventually be discussed. Among the demands, changes to how provincial liquor boards stock American alcohol products, modifications to Canada's supply management system for dairy, movement on digital services regulation. The posture was explicit. You give us these things first, then we talk. Carney stood at the microphone and delivered the response in a tone that was deliberate and unhurried, which made it more devastating than if he'd shouted it. He did not reach for anger. He reached for precision. He said, "You know what's an irritant? A 50% tariff on steel, a 50% tariff on aluminum, a 25% tariff on automobiles, all the tariffs on forest products. Those are more than irritants. Those are violations of our trade deal." He paused, let the words sit in the air. Then he delivered the second half, the line that reframed the entire negotiating architecture. He said the long period of deep integration between Canada and the United States is over. Not wounded, not paused, over. And he said nostalgia is not a strategy. Hope is not a strategy. Canada is not going back to exactly the way things were. Now here is what Carney was actually thinking in that moment versus what the words sound like on the surface. He wasn't announcing a breakup. He was removing leverage. The Trump administration's entire pressure strategy depends on the assumption that Canada is so economically dependent on American market access that it cannot afford to walk away from any deal, no matter how one-sided. By stating publicly and calmly that the old era of integration is finished, that the dependency itself is the problem, not just the tariffs, Carney was doing something structurally significant. He was telling the other side, the thing you are using to pressure us is the thing we are already in the process of dismantling. You cannot threaten someone with the removal of something they have publicly committed to replacing. The room changed when he said it, not because it solved anything, but because it closed a psychological door. Receipt 1. The steel and aluminum tariffs are not inflicting one-sided damage. They are inflicting damage in both directions, and the American side of the wound is becoming impossible to ignore. Oxford Economics, in its baseline forecast for 2026, noted that the Trump administration has shown signs of softening their view on tariffs as a blunt instrument for their industrial strategy. Why? Because by November 2025, the United States had already been forced to roll back tariffs on coffee, beef, and other consumer staples after sharp retail price inflation in those categories hit American households directly. The Bank of Canada confirmed in its October forecasts that Canadian supply chains, deeply integrated with American manufacturing, were transmitting the tariff shock bidirectionally. Auto parts plant in Windsor, that is also a supplier to Ford in Michigan. When that plant's production schedule goes under review, the component doesn't get made in Ohio instead. In many cases, it simply doesn't get made on time. The verdict on Receipt 1, tariff pain is not a Canadian problem. It is a shared structural problem that the U.S. side has been pretending is a Canadian problem. But that is only part of it. Receipt 2. Canada made concessions in 2025 and received nothing in return. This is documented. The Liberal government dropped its digital services tax on U.S. tech giants. It removed or chose not to proceed with a significant tranche of retaliatory tariffs. The September 2025 decision to eliminate most counter tariffs on U.S. goods was a direct response to the U.S. allowing most Canadian goods to enter tariff-free under CUSMA compliance. Canada's Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc has stated explicitly that Canada gave those concessions in good faith, and that they brought the two sides close to a broader deal, before Ontario Premier Doug Ford ran a television ad criticizing tariffs that referenced Ronald Reagan, angered Trump personally, and derailed progress. Canada gave. The U.S. pocketed it. And then the U.S. came back with more demands. Now go back to Windsor for a moment. When Canada dropped those retaliatory tariffs in September 2025, the press line worker did not see his production schedule stabilize. The sectoral tariffs on auto parts stayed. The relief he needed was not in the tranche Canada conceded. He got nothing from the concession his own government made. And the logic Carney is now articulating, no more pre-negotiation concessions, traces directly back to that experience. Early concessions did not produce reciprocal relief. They produced more demands. The verdict on Receipt 2. Canada's concession history is not a negotiating chip. It is evidence. Here is where it gets structurally important. Receipt 3. The CUSMA review deadline is July 1, 2026. That is the date when Article 34.7 of the agreement requires all three parties, Canada, the United States, and Mexico, to sit down and assess how the agreement is functioning. All three parties have initiated domestic consultations. The U.S. Trade Representative has already identified its priorities: Canada's dairy supply management system, softwood lumber subsidies, automotive rules of origin, digital regulation, and the transshipment risk involving Chinese goods. Canada's position is that those topics cannot be separated from the sectoral tariffs that are currently running in direct violation of the spirit of the agreement. The U.S. position is that CUSMA review is a separate and distinct track from the Section 232 tariffs. Canada's negotiators do not accept that separation. And that disagreement about the architecture of the negotiation is the core dispute beneath the surface dispute. Tony Stillo, Director of Canada Economics at Oxford Economics, put it plainly. If the CUSMA exemption were to end, if the review collapsed and the full weight of current tariffs without any compliance exemptions landed on the Canadian economy, it would produce longer-term scarring. He said the size of the Canadian economy would be lower for several years, probably permanently. The verdict on Receipt 3, July 1, 2026, is not a bureaucratic calendar note. It is the most important date in the Canada-U.S. relationship in a generation. Here's what you need to understand right now before we go any deeper. The tariff numbers and the negotiating positions and the legal authorities, those are the surface of this story. But the real stakes are personal. If the CUSMA exemption survives July and the sectoral tariffs on steel and aluminum get folded into a broader relief package, the Windsor plant gets a production schedule. The mortgage holds. The kids finish school with a parent who kept his job. If the exemption collapses and the full tariff weight lands, Oxford Economics baseline scenario calls that permanent scarring. Then that plant closes its press line, not temporarily, not until conditions improve. The math does not recover at those tariff levels. That is a family-level consequence in thousands of communities on both sides of the border. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Do you think Canada gets a real deal before July, or does this go all the way to the edge? I want to know what you think. Here is the thing that most coverage of this story is completely missing. Every outlet is focused on the drama of the negotiating positions. Who said what? Who walked out? Which sector got named? But the story underneath is about the legal architecture being dismantled in real time, and what that means for any country that thought it had a signed agreement with the United States. The U.S. Supreme Court ruling in early 2026 that struck down the IEEPA tariff authority was supposed to provide relief, and in a narrow legal sense, it did. Canadian businesses that paid tariffs under IEEPA between February 4, 2025 and February 24, 2026 may now be eligible for refunds. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business confirmed this as of April 20, 2026. But here is the part the headlines buried. The administration's response to losing that legal authority was not to reduce tariffs. It was to immediately deploy a different statutory instrument, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, to impose a 10% import surcharge for 150 days on most U.S. imports. The tariff did not go away. The legal wrapper changed. Let me translate that for you in plain language. What that actually means is this. When the legal basis for a tariff gets struck down by the Supreme Court, the tariff just gets reissued under a different label. The physical check that Canadian businesses write at the border does not change. The line item on their cost sheets does not change. The pressure on their margins does not change. The only thing that changed was the statutory citation in the fine print. And the businesses waiting for meaningful relief are still waiting. This is what Carney means when he says, hope is not a strategy. Because every time Canada found a reason to hope, the Supreme Court ruling, the September concessions, the near deal that collapsed over a television ad, the pressure did not lift. It just restructured itself. Now here is what this story is really about at a strategic level, and nobody has explained it this clearly yet. There are 3 analytical moves you need to make to understand what Carney is actually doing, not just what he is saying. The first move is recognizing that this is a negotiating doctrine, not a diplomatic statement. When Carney says the era of deep integration is over, he is not announcing a policy. He is deploying a posture. The Trump administration's leverage depends on Canadian fear of losing American market access. That fear is real. The United States absorbs the vast majority of Canadian exports. But fear only functions as leverage if the party being pressured believes there is no alternative path. By publicly and credibly investing in diversification, the January 2026 deal with China that lowered tariffs on Canadian agricultural products in exchange for market access for Chinese electric vehicles, the push for new investment from global partners, the expanded domestic energy capacity planning. Carney is not primarily trying to replace the U.S. market overnight. He is trying to reduce the credibility of the threat. In plain language, if Canada is visibly building an exit, the threat of blocking the door loses its power. The second move is understanding the asymmetry of accountability. When Canada frames U.S. tariffs as violations of a signed agreement rather than irritants to be negotiated, it does something to the international audience of this dispute that the domestic drama obscures. Other U.S. trading partners are watching. The question every allied government is quietly asking right now is, if the United States will treat a major trading partner and CUSMA signatory this way, what does our own signed agreement with Washington actually guarantee? The reputational cost to American credibility in trade negotiations globally is not being measured in any of the tariff impact models, but it is real. And Carney naming it violations rather than irritants is partly a message for that audience. In plain language, the word violation is a transmission to every country currently in any trade negotiation with the United States. The third move is the absence. Notice what the Trump administration has not done in this dispute. It has not offered a single reciprocal concession to Canada, not one. It has demanded changes to dairy access, alcohol distribution, digital regulation, lumber practices, and automotive rules of origin. In exchange, it has offered the possibility of a conversation, not relief, not reduced tariffs, not a pause in the escalation, just access to the room. And Canada, which has historically entered these conversations with deference and a willingness to give something early to establish goodwill, has stopped doing that. The absence of the early concession is not a failure of diplomacy. It is a deliberate decision based on the documented evidence that early concessions in this administration's negotiating pattern do not produce reciprocal movement. They produce the next demand. In plain language, what Carney didn't do is the most important thing he did. The doctrine this points to is what we might call the asymmetric dependency correction. A country in an unequal relationship does not escape the inequality by negotiating harder within the existing frame. It escapes by changing the frame itself. Carney is not trying to win the current negotiation. He is trying to make the current negotiation's terms unacceptable so that the next negotiation starts from a different baseline. The people on opposite sides of this issue are starting to converge on one point. Beata Caranci, chief economist at TD Bank, has noted that the tariff disruption has introduced a level of business investment paralysis in Canada that the aggregate trade numbers don't fully capture. Companies are not just absorbing the tariff cost, They are delaying capital decisions until the July CUSMA review clarifies the medium-term landscape. When investment pauses, it doesn't just pause, it redirects. And the window for Canada to capture that redirected capital is finite. Flavio Volpe, president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association of Canada, has stated publicly that the integrated North American auto supply chain cannot function under sustained tariff pressure. The argument that U.S. auto jobs are returning because of tariffs, which the U.S. Trade Representative made before Congress this spring, looks different when you account for the component-level disruption that shows up not in headline employment figures, but in production downtime, quality incidents, and delayed model launches. The jobs that nominally returned to the U.S. in some assembly categories came at the cost of instability in the supply chains that feed them. Rudyard Griffiths, a Canadian foreign policy analyst, framed the broader strategic question this way: Canada is not choosing between dependence and independence. It is choosing between managed dependency with negotiating leverage and unmanaged dependency with none. And when economists at TD, manufacturers associations, and foreign policy analysts are all pointing to the same underlying structural problem, the unsustainability of a relationship where one party makes demands and the other makes concessions, you pay attention. To be fair, there is a genuine argument on the other side of this, and it deserves to be heard seriously. The strongest version of the American position is not the public rhetoric about irritants. The strongest version is this: CUSMA was designed for a world where China's manufacturing capacity and trade practices were different. The rise of Chinese industrial overcapacity, specifically in steel and aluminum, has created a genuine transshipment risk where Chinese goods get routed through Canada or Mexico and enter the U.S. market as if they were North American products. The U.S. argument is that CUSMA-compliant certification has become insufficient to guarantee the geographic and labor origin of goods, and that sectoral tariffs are a blunt but necessary tool to pressure partners to tighten their enforcement. The U.S. Trade Representative's Section 301 investigation, launched in March 2026, examining 60 partners, including Canada, regarding their enforcement of prohibitions on goods produced with forced labor, is the institutional expression of this concern. The second genuinely strong argument is domestic. The American manufacturing base in steel and aluminum genuinely contracted over decades of import competition. The communities affected by that contraction have real political weight, and an administration that campaigned on reversing that contraction has an electoral obligation to be seen acting on it. Tariffs, as industrial policy, have a long bipartisan history in the United States. Carney calling them violations does not make them illegal under domestic U.S. law. It makes them violations of a bilateral agreement. That is a real distinction. The pivot back, however, is this. The documented evidence is that Canada has been tightening its own steel import quotas to address the transshipment concern. The December 2025 measures reduced non-FTA partner steel import quotas to 20% of 2024 levels. Canada is addressing the stated concern, and it is still facing 50% steel tariffs, which means the tariffs are no longer tracking the stated justification. They have become something else. Structurally, that something else looks like leverage extraction.